childhood trauma and a mental health diagnosis. They often go together, and sometimes it can be really helpful to receive a diagnosis. Other times, not so much. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. So, I'm doing this episode because I had a conversation recently with somebody around a bipolar diagnosis, and it just kind of got me thinking about the broader issue, I guess. And so I thought I would do this video. I also did a video relatively recently on whether childhood trauma is a mental illness. So if you haven't seen that, you might find that one helpful too. So I mentioned that sometimes a diagnosis can be helpful and other times maybe not so much. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because oftentimes the diagnosis that somebody is given isn't necessarily an accurate diagnosis. And that is the biggest issue. So over the years that I've been doing this work, I have known in my own work, and then certainly from hearing about other people's experiences, many people who have been diagnosed with something that isn't necessarily completely accurate, in part because it's not the full picture, and there are factors that play into some of the symptoms that somebody might be looking at that create the criteria in which is supposed to be met to get that diagnosis. So using the example of bipolar disorder, and this is definitely one that has been, I think, misdiagnosed many times over the years that I've been doing this work. And when I talk about somebody being misdiagnosed, I, as a clinical social worker, when I had my in-person practice, that gave me the ability to actually diagnose people. I'm no longer licensed. I don't practice therapy any longer. So I'm not diagnosing people. And truthfully, I actually didn't really diagnose people then either. I could. I just didn't think that they needed a diagnosis generally. So a diagnosis is helpful. Unfortunately, in the US, at least, with our health insurance the way that it is, people, in order to get treatment, in order for insurance to pay for treatment, you have to have a diagnosis. And when it comes to mental health treatment, the diagnosis that you need to have in order to be reimbursed is a mental health diagnosis. So in order for your medications, in order for your, for your medications, as well as if you receive therapy or psychiatry services, you need to have a diagnosis. And so a diagnosis is given, and oftentimes it can kind of fit, but maybe not completely fit. And what happens with that, particularly when it's something like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, ADHD, all of those disorders, so to speak, typically have medication that goes along with them. So oftentimes people are given a diagnosis that stays on their medical history indefinitely. And then they're also given medication to go along with that diagnosis. Now, sometimes the medication can be helpful with or without a diagnosis. Sometimes it can be helpful. Again, other times maybe not so much, in part possibly because it's not an accurate diagnosis. And I'm certainly not trying to suggest that doctors or psychiatrists or therapists, whatever, are misinformed and doing a terrible job of diagnosing people. That's not what I'm trying to suggest here. The reason that I'm actually doing this video is for you, as somebody who may have experienced childhood trauma, who's maybe received a diagnosis or several, maybe on a medication or many, are able to recognize that even if you're given an accurate diagnosis at one point, it may not be an ongoing, lifelong diagnosis that you have. Because with all of those things that I mentioned, generally speaking, for childhood trauma survivors, the symptoms of those diagnoses, the symptoms that somebody is checking off to give you that diagnosis, those are often pretty normal symptoms of somebody who has experienced childhood trauma. They're normal reactions. They're normal ways of coping. Now, I'm not saying they're healthy, because oftentimes, most times, they're not, but they're normal. And fortunately, I don't remember where I saw this, but relatively recently, I actually saw something, I think it was something I read, in which they were suggesting that somehow the childhood trauma itself should be its own category without any other sort of mental health diagnosis, that just identifying somebody as a childhood trauma survivor, that's all you need to basically identify. And then all the symptoms that can go along with that fit into that. So it's not necessarily like a mental health diagnosis. So, and I'm completely on board for that. So many of the symptoms, for somebody watching this, you're likely a survivor of childhood trauma. Many of the symptoms that you experience, the struggles, the challenges, even within relationships, so it doesn't have to be how you feel, like depression or anxiety. It can be how you show up in the world or don't show up in the world. It can be how you struggle with relationships or not going after the things that you want, more like so-called mindset types of things. All of that can be very normal responses to coping and surviving childhood trauma. But when somebody is given a diagnosis and they're given the medication, one of the things that I have seen, particularly when the medication is prescribed by a family physician, is that counseling therapy often isn't even brought up, certainly not suggested. And so therefore, you don't ever get an opportunity to really heal what has created those symptoms in the first place. It's just this idea that, well, here's your diagnosis and here's your medicine, and you just have to find a way to manage. And that honestly kind of is heartbreaking. The same for anxiety and the same for bipolar. So one of the things with bipolar disorder is that it's not something that goes away. True bipolar disorder is about how your brain works, and it's not something for a true disorder is not going to go away. Medication can help manage it, but if you stop taking the medication, you're always going to struggle with that, no matter how much healing you might do. But I've known many people over the years that have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder who, through their healing, don't struggle in the same ways anymore. So therefore, it's really not bipolar disorder. And some of the medications that people are given, particularly for anxiety and bipolar disorder, or even ADHD, because there is some overlap in terms of symptomology with ADHD and being a survivor of childhood trauma. Some of those medications are pretty powerful and can impact how you're able to fully show up in your healing process. It can kind of numb some things, kind of feel disconnected from some things, and that can inhibit. Doesn't mean that you won't be able to heal, but it can inhibit the process a little bit. So that really can be a complicating factor if you are working on healing. Now, if you truly do have something like bipolar disorder, it is important to take the medication. And it is still really beneficial and important to work on healing if you are a survivor of childhood trauma, or I guess anything really that you need to heal from, because you can still do healing, obviously. And if you truly do have bipolar disorder, then having that addressed with medication and whatever else might be necessary is going to be an important part of your healing. But one of the things that I have seen, including the recent conversation I had and in some people that I have worked with, is they're given this diagnosis of bipolar disorder often because they have difficulty with intense feelings. Like they might be feeling really down in one moment and then feeling really what would be perceived as kind of manic in a next moment. So that could be like happy and boisterous and talking a lot or different kinds of things like that. But it can be kind of like an extreme, like going from kind of depressed, not wanting to get out of bed to that. And of course, there can be lots of fluctuations in there. But another one I have seen is anger, that they are very quick to get angry. And that has been one of the reasons in particular that I'm thinking of for one person that was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, because she was easily angered. She could get really flustered and frustrated and had difficulty managing that anger. And it was like that, like it was really quick that it would happen. And so given that diagnosis, but when it comes to being a survivor of childhood trauma, it is completely natural that you can go from kind of one extreme, so to speak, to the other, where you can be feeling pretty good, relatively speaking, whatever that might look like for you, where you can be feeling pretty good, maybe hopeful, and then seemingly for no reason, you're really struggling. You don't want to leave the house. You don't want to talk to anybody. You might be really emotional, or feeling really, really good and then feeling really angry. But there's this kind of really sudden shift in how you feel. And sometimes it might be really obvious in terms of how suddenly that happens. And other times it might be that you just recognize like, wow, just yesterday I was feeling like this and now I'm feeling like this. But that can be a really normal experience for people because, particularly when you're on this healing journey, as you are kind of dismantling all these false ideas about yourself and who you are in the world, you start to build that sense of hope. You start to allow yourself to experience feelings of connection and maybe even happiness or joy and peace. So all types of like good feelings. But because you're in the process of healing and part of your way of coping has been to not really allow yourself to feel those things, to experience those things. Because when you allow yourself to experience those things, you have more to lose, so to speak. If you don't ever really allow yourself to feel those things, then, well, this is just kind of my life. This is what I can expect. And I'm used to this and I know how to deal with it. That might be conscious. Oftentimes it's not. But when you allow those moments in that are better, feel better, lighter, easier, whatever it might be, the self-protective part of you that has kept you safe throughout your life, or at least seemingly, that's what it thinks it's doing anyway, because it feels different, it can feel uneasy. Because it feels uneasy, that self-protective part of you is going to try to pull you back from those feelings. And in doing that, it often is going to try to remind you why it's not a good idea to feel those things or to do those things that are allowing you to feel those things. So I mentioned connection. So what might happen if you allow yourself to experience something that creates that sense of connection for you immediately afterward, or maybe the next day, the self-protective part will start questioning it, doubting it, thinking, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. And again, you might be consciously aware of these thoughts, and you may not be. But in that self-protection, it's going to tell you all the reasons why that's not a good idea. And it might show up as shame. It might show up as doubting the person or people in general. It might show up as doubting yourself. Like, who am I to think that this could be real? Or who am I to whatever? So the back and forth, the feeling hopeful or good in some way, the self-doubt, the shame, maybe even the sense of isolation, and therefore it typically leading to a sense of feeling kind of depressed, maybe even hopeless, that can shift really quickly because that self-protection kicks in almost automatically, and sometimes immediately, sometimes after a little while. And the more healing you do, typically it's going to take a little bit longer for that to happen. Not always, but often. So when those things happen, people will often think, or even a mental health person or a family physician might look at that and think that it's extremes in emotional regulation, difficulty in being able to regulate your emotions. And while that can be true that you might have difficulty regulating your emotions, it does not automatically mean that you have clinical depression or bipolar disorder or any number of other things. And so the reason that I wanted to share this with you is because the other thing that can happen with a diagnosis is that it can feel, and when I say feel, I mean like literally a feeling that we have, this emotional experience that we have, that this is our life. Well, I'm depressed. I'm bipolar. I have anxiety, or I am anxious. And you see that as who you are. And oftentimes, it's a diagnosis that we believe is the way that we will always be. And that can feel disheartening. It can feel depressing. It can feel scary. And maybe most significantly, it can make you believe that there's really nothing you can do to change how you struggle. And that, I think, is incredibly heartbreaking. Because if you are a survivor of childhood trauma, I can pretty confidently say, of course, I can't say this 100%, but certainly by far for most people, whatever it is that you're struggling with on an emotional level, going through the healing process can make a significant difference, if not completely change how you feel day to day and in a much bigger picture. Because when you begin to believe differently about who you are, when you begin to be able to see the truth, to trust in the truth of who you are, then a lot of that stuff that you struggle with naturally goes away. Because when you believe in who you are, and this doesn't mean that you have to think that you're perfect or that you never make mistakes or that you never struggle. But when you let go, when you heal, it needs to be healed so that you can let go of the belief that you're unworthy or undeserving or not good enough or even bad. When you can let that go, everything else that you end up experiencing, you experience it on a whole different level. You get to take in the good things around you. You get to trust and feel connected to the good things within you. Because those things are real. But when we have these beliefs about ourselves that we're not good enough, that we're bad, that somehow it's our fault that these things happened, that it's our fault that we struggle in the ways that we do, and it just means something about who I am, my character, my weakness. It's really hard to ever feel grounded and safe enough to live your life in a way that does bring true peace and connection and joy. So whether you've had a diagnosis or not, a formal diagnosis, or you've self-diagnosed, whether you're on medication or not, whatever the diagnosis is, please don't let it keep you from healing, from giving yourself the opportunity to feel, to trust in yourself first and foremost, and then what is possible for you in your life. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it more easily. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.